Welcome to another one of our cooking demonstrations by our preferred caterers. Today's cooking demonstration is brought to you by one of Adat Israel's preferred caterers, F+B Kosher, which is owned and operated by Carrie Silber and David Silber, formerly known as Applause Catering. F+B deliver outstanding contemporary kosher cuisine to the discerning palates of Toronto's kosher clientele. F+B Kosher is a fixture in Toronto's kosher catering industry, executing multi-scale functions for Toronto's local residents and guests from around the world. F+B operates under strict core supervision and works seamlessly with clients, venues, and event planners and other key stakeholders to create customized menus that deliver both unforgettable food and flawless execution. Sarah McCulloch is here with us today straight from the F+B office. She is the executive pastry chef at F+B Kosher. Sarah's career started at George Brown College for Culinary Arts with a specialty in baking and pastry. Sarah's career included working in specialty bakeries and high-end French pastry shops around the GTA, as well as Edmonton, Alberta. She has mastered such skills as the French macaroon and delicate French pastries and breads like brioche and croissants. She has learned to love the challenge of making delicious and beautiful desserts using dairy substitutes in F+B Strictly Kosher Kitchen. Sarah will be making a strawberry rhubarb tart with us today. I am reminding you to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll stop partway through and ask questions in the middle as well at the end. Just to let you know, in the interest of time, Sarah will be putting together the crust, but not baking it. She has one baked, so she will put it together and then magically one will appear baked. So Sarah, I turn it over to you and look forward to learning about strawberry rhubarb tart.
Okay, thank you, Carol, and thank you everyone who has tuned in to join me today. I hope you're all having a wonderful afternoon so far. Like Carol said, I will be making a strawberry rhubarb tart today. And one of the things I love about this recipe is that it's super versatile. There's a bunch of different things that you can do to adjust if you want a different product. But today I'm going to be making individual little 4-inch tarts. If you want, you can make this into a 9-inch pie. You can make this into a fruit crisp with no crust on the bottom. And I'll just show you little techniques on how to adjust the recipe to something that suits your needs while I'm going. So we'll jump right into it. We're going to start by making the dough for the crust. And it's just a sweet dough. It's a kind of like a sugar cookie dough. And it's really versatile, really stable for this application. So what you're going to do, I hope you're all following your recipes at home. So we're going to start with our vegetable shortening. That's my substitute for butter that I'm using today. I like vegetable shortening because it's hard at room temperature. So in a tart like this, where you want the edges to stay nice and straight, shortening is a great option for you because it's not going to get super soft or melty, and that's going to show throughout the baking process. So I'm going to start by putting the shortening into the mixer along with the icing sugar. And you're going to want to make sure that your shortening is at room temperature for this. It's just going to mix in a lot nicer. So that goes in with the icing sugar. So that's 190 grams of shortening and 95 grams of icing sugar into the mixer. And if all you have is a hand blender would work fine for this as well. You just want to be able to mix the ingredients together nicely. So I'm just going to get that going. Okay, we're going to go on a medium speed, and we're just looking for the sugar and the shortening to kind of become one. So it's going to become like a smooth paste, and then at that point, you know that you're ready to add the egg. So we're going to add an egg to this, and we're going to add all-purpose flour. So it's only 4 ingredients, really simple, and it's going to give us a nice crust for our tart. All right. So at this point, I'm going to drop in the egg. You can do it while the mixer's running. Just be careful it's not going to fly up at you. You might want to reduce your speed a little bit. Here we are. always a good idea when you're baking to scrape down the sides of your mixing bowl as you're going, because it really helps to make sure that all your ingredients are mixed together evenly. So I'm just going to give this a quick scrape, and I can see that there are little bits of icing sugar that haven't quite mixed in. They're hanging out around the paddle, around the sides of the bowl. So I'm just going to scrape that all up, and it's going to allow this dough to mix really evenly. Okay, back on. And as soon as your egg mixes in, again, we're just looking for it to become homogeneous, to come together, and we can throw in our flour. I'm going to increase the speed a little bit. So I'm at about a medium-high speed right now. Great. I'm going to stop the mixer. Flour you definitely don't want to add while it's mixing. It will come all over the place. It will come out of the bowl at you. So we're going to start mixing this. All the flour goes in at once. And we're going to start our mixer on a slow speed, just to make sure that we're not going to make a big mess here. And you can see this comes together pretty quickly. We're almost done the crust already. So if you have made the crust the day before, in the recipe it says that you can make the crust and then chill it. So having a little bit of a colder crust just makes it a bit easier to handle. But if you're taking it out from the fridge and using it instead of making it fresh like I am today, you're going to want to mix it up a little bit just to bring it kind of closer to room temperature. It's going to be a lot easier for you to roll out. All right, so I'm just giving this a chance to fully come together. Looking good. So this same recipe for this crust can be used for sugar cookies or any other pie, maybe a lemon meringue pie, lemon bars. It's really versatile. So I'm just going to say this. We're going to make the crumble in the same mixing bowl later, and you don't really need to wash it. It's pretty much the same ingredients. Okay, so you can see we have a nice soft dough that's formed here. So we're going to roll this out and start filling our tart shells. So you just want to make sure that your work surface is nice and clean before you put any food on the table. And I just have a little bit of all-purpose flour on the side here, and that's just to dust the table, just to make sure that the dough is not going to stick. So I'm just going to lightly dust my work surface with flour. And I'm going to get my ball of dough, and I'm just going to squish it and make sure that maybe knead it a little bit, just to make sure that it's all together into a nice smooth ball. Okay, so you can see I have a nice smooth ball of dough here. I'm going to put it right on my flour. I'm going to flour the top of it a little bit as well, so that my rolling pin doesn't stick. And I'm just going to roll it out. So you're going to want to roll it out to about, I'm doing about 1/8 of an inch, so pretty thin for these little tarts, just because they're little individual tarts. If you were doing a full 9-inch pie, it would be okay closer to 1/4 of an inch or a little thicker. It just depends on what you're doing. So I'm going to use this rolling pin. This is a French rolling pin. It doesn't have handles. I really prefer this rolling pin because you get a bit more control. You can feel kind of where you're pressing. So I'm just going to roll this out nice and thin, and I'm just going to pick it up and just turn it around a little bit as I'm going, just to make sure it's not sticking to the table. And if you find that the edges are cracking a little bit as you roll, that's okay. Just push it back together with your hands. Every once in a while, like I said, just pick it up, move it around a little bit, make sure it's not sticking to the table. If you need to add a little bit more flour on top, that's okay. I'm just going to keep rolling. Try and make a nice even crust here. Make sure you're going to the edges. Make sure your edges aren't super thick and the center is really thin. Just try and pay attention and make it as even as possible. But you'll see when we fill them that it doesn't have to be perfect, and there's definitely room for error here. You can fix it quite easily. Okay, so I've got my dough rolled out nice and thin. And I'm going to put it inside the tart shell. So like I said, I have these little 4-inch aluminum tart shells. You can buy them on Amazon or at like a kitchen supply store, but you can also find like aluminum foil disposable ones at the dollar store or the grocery store, which would work fine as well. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put that on top of my dough. And I'm going to use a small paring knife to cut around. So I'm going to cut about 1 inch out so that there's room for the dough to go up the side. And I'm just going to cut a circle, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, just around the tart shell, just like this. And I'm going to move the tart shell aside, and I'm just going to gently pick up this piece of dough. And if it rips a little bit, that's okay. You're going to see how we're going to patch it up inside the tart. So I'm just delicately lifting up this piece of dough, and I'm just going to drop it in the middle of my tart. And I'm going to push the corners down. So I'm taking the edge of the dough and I'm pushing it down into the corner of that tart shell. And if it breaks a little bit as you go, it's okay. You can just press it back together with your hand. But what you want to do is just to make sure that that dough is getting into the corners so that you don't have like a bowl shape. You want straight edge corners. That way you're going to have a lot more room for the filling. And I'm just gently pressing into the corners, pressing down on the bottom of the tart shell to make sure that I have an even layer of dough here. And some of it has fallen off, but if you still have some excess around the edges sticking up, you're just going to grab your little knife and just gently away from you, just so that you don't hurt yourself. You're just going to cut off that excess dough. It's just going to give you a really nice clean edge on your tart. Okay, and if you had a rip in your dough, you can just pick up any excess piece of dough and just patch it in there. This is going to get filled, so it's okay if it's not perfect. The thing you want to focus on most is that you have a relatively even crust, and that everything is covered and that your edges are nice and straight. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to do one more just so you can see. So again, I'm just going to put it on. I'm going to cut about 1 inch around, just like that. I'm going to pick up this piece of dough. This one's going to rip on me a little bit, but you'll see how easy it is to just patch it up. Pushing it into the corners of the tart shell. I have some rips here, so again, I'm just pushing the dough together with my fingers. It's super forgiving, great for beginners. Don't be intimidated by these little tart shells. You can do the exact same thing with a 9-inch pie. The only thing, if you're making a large pie, I would probably double the recipe of filling, just because it's going to take a lot more fruit to fill up a full pie. You would get more servings out of that as well. I'm making 6 small tarts today. So I'm just pressing the edges, making sure that's even, pressing down the bottom, making sure I have my straight sides, and then I'm going to trim off the excess. Just like that. Okay, perfect. So cute. Okay, just have one left here. Okay, pushing into the sides. This one broke on me real good, but that's okay. We're just going to patch it up. And you know what? If you mix it with your hands a little bit after it comes out of the mixer, it will be a lot smoother for you. Also, it would help to keep it in the fridge and chill it a little bit. It'll be a lot easier to manage. But that's okay. I'm just going to patch it up a little bit on the side here. I'm missing some dough, but it's that easy. Even if it crumbles, you can still make a beautiful tart. You just need to press it down into the sides a little bit, but it looks great. And you'll see, you won't be able to tell the difference after it's baked. So again, I'm just going to cut off the excess, just like that. And then these tarts are ready to go into the oven. So we're going to pre-bake these tarts. Just because the crust like this will take a little bit longer than the crumble topping. wood, so we want to give these a head start. So we're going to bake these for 15 minutes in the oven until they're lightly golden brown. This extra dough, you can, like I said, you can bring out a cookie cutter, you can make some sugar cookies, you can keep it in the freezer, just wrap tightly with saran wrap or in a freezer bag, and you can save it for another day. It'll probably keep in the freezer for a couple months. I would just remove it from the freezer a couple days before you want to use it, and then make sure you mix it really well with your hands, just like I'm doing right now before you use it. Okay, great. So these are our tart shells here, all done. Before I put them in the oven, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a fork, or you could use your small knife, doesn't matter, and I'm going to poke holes. So that's called docking. And what that does for us is it gives us some holes in the bottom so that as this crust cooks, the steam that's being created has a place to escape. So it's not going to give you like a rounded bottom. It'll give you a nice flat bottom. Okay, so just a couple of holes, just like that. And then this is when we would put these in the oven, 350 for 15 minutes. I have some already baked, but you can see these are all set to go. So I'm just going to put these on the side, and with the magic of television, pre-baked, ready to go. So these are nice golden brown. These are already cooked. One little tip that I would suggest with these is that while they're baking, you may find that the dough puffs up a little bit, and you're not going to keep the same amount of, or the same straight edges that you made. And an easy fix for this is to just take something flat. I have a little sugar shaker here, but you can use a cup or a condiment bottle as long as it's clean, something with a flat bottom. And as soon as it comes out of the oven, while the crust is still hot, just press down into the edges, and that'll flatten it right out. And that'll give you a lot more room for your filling, and it'll make a better tart in the end. If you've pre-made your tart shells and maybe you missed this tip, what you can do is just pop the tray back in the oven for a couple of minutes. That'll soften up the crust, and then you can do this same thing. Okay, so that'll just leave a little bit more room for our filling. So these are ready to go. These are ready to fill. They're pretty much 100% cooked. Okay, they'll get a little crispier while we bake it with the filling, but not too much because it's going to have that wet filling in there. So I'm just going to put these aside while we cook our filling. And I'm just going to wipe down my table. Obviously, I have some flour. Okay. So I'm going to bring up my burner. Now we're going to cook this pie filling. And there are two main ways to make tart and pie fillings, and that's a cooked filling or a not cooked filling. So sometimes you might see a pie recipe and it might just have some fruit mixed with some sugar, maybe some flour, maybe some seasoning, right into the pie shell and right into the oven. And that's a non-cooked pie filling. What I love about cooked fillings, though, is that you can really take control of the consistency of your filling. So you know before you put the pie in the oven that your filling is at the perfect consistency. Whereas with an uncooked pie filling, maybe you needed some more starch, some more flour in your recipe, and it's baked and it's kind of liquidy on the inside. It's almost too late, but with a cooked filling, you can make sure that it's perfect before you even make your pie, your pies or your tarts. So it's a really easy way to make perfect pie filling every single time. So I have pre-cut washed strawberries here. I've cut them in quarters just because these strawberries were huge. I have frozen rhubarb. Fresh would be fine as well. Just keep in mind that fresh fruit tend to have a little bit less liquid in them. So you might need a little less starch, but generally it would be about the same. So I'm going to get this on, and I'm just going to keep it on a medium-high heat. And I'm going to add my fruit, rhubarb, strawberry. I'm going to add the sugar and the vanilla, and I'm going to keep the cornstarch and the water on the side for now. That's going to go in later. little bit of vanilla. I'm using vanilla bean paste, but vanilla extract is perfectly fine. So this is just going to take a couple of minutes, and the fruit is going to start to release some of its juices. The sugar is going to start to melt. We want to bring this up to a boil before we add our starch. So starch, generally, if you're using starch, I'm using cornstarch today. When you add starch to a recipe, you want to make sure that whatever you're adding it to is hot. It will work a lot faster that way. So I do have my cornstarch and my water here, which we're going to mix together later to go in this filling. This is already starting to sizzle. As it starts, it's pretty dry right now. You're going to see in a couple of minutes it'll release some of its moisture, but while it's dry, just make sure you're stirring it around a little bit just so it doesn't burn. Okay, so we're going to give this a couple of minutes. And you're going to see right now it's dry, but it's going to start cooking down. I'm using a frying pan just so that you can see kind of what's going on right now, but a pot is perfectly fine for this. Okay, so just a reminder, if you guys have any questions throughout this demo, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A. If we have any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them while this is cooking.
Okay, Sarah, we do have some questions.
Okay, great.
One question is, can coconut oil be used as a substitute for the vegetable shortening?
Okay, so I would prefer not to use something like that, and I'll tell you why. Because coconut oil is a lot softer at room temperature. So depending on the temperature of your room, it can even be almost liquid. So it will be a lot harder to work with. Not that you can't use it. I'm just not confident that you'd use it with this recipe. You might want to adjust the amount of flour just to allow for that extra moisture that's in the coconut oil. So the reason I use shortening is because it's hard even at room temperature. Coconut oil isn't. So it will give you a much pastier dough. Might be a little harder to work with, and it might even melt down the sides while you're cooking. So I wouldn't recommend it for this, but potentially for the crumble aspect of it, coconut oil would be fine.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, with a hand mixer, do you use both the beaters for the dough, or is it better to use one for the crust?
I would use both. You want to make sure that, you want to make sure that your shortening and your sugar are mixed together really well. So you do want to beat it quite quickly, even with a hand blender. Potentially, once you add the flour and it's thick, you may have to mix a little bit by hand, a little bit more than you would with a stand mixer like this, just because it does get pretty thick. It might be too thick for your specific hand mixer, but it would work fine for the shortening, the sugar, the egg, and then you might just need to mix a little bit more by hand once you're finished.
Thank you. And how many tarts does this recipe make?
So this recipe I'm making 6 individual tarts. So the tart shells I'm using are 4-inch. Right. And this filling is just about perfect for those 6. You might have a little bit of leftover dough and a little bit of leftover crumble, but the filling is perfect for 6 individual portions.
And if you wanted to make a pie instead of the individual tarts,
yeah,
is this the right amount for a pie?
So the fruit filling should probably be doubled for a full size pie, just because it's going to be a little bit thicker, and you're going to be serving probably about 8 to 10 people from that pie. So you might want to double this recipe to fill up a 9-inch pie. But the crust and the crumble for this recipe will be fine for a 9-inch pie. You don't need to change that at all.
Very good, thank you. Those are the questions that we have in the Q&A at the moment. So thank you. One that I had, what about using other berries or other fruits or?
Great question. So what I said about this recipe at the beginning is that it's super versatile. So you can use this as a base for so many other recipes. And just like Carol said, you can switch it out with different fruits. So the only thing to note when you're switching out different fruits is, and it's just kind of common sense, just taste the fruit. How does it taste? Is it really sweet? If it's really sweet, unlike rhubarb, which is very tart, you might want to cut back your sugar a little bit. Or, instead of vanilla, maybe you're making a blueberry pie filling. What would go great with blueberry? Maybe add some lemon zest to that. That would be a great option. Or if you're making apple pie filling, maybe add some cinnamon in place of the vanilla. So there's different things that you can do, but it's all the same base recipe. So it's all just basically fruit, sugar, and a little bit of cornstarch to thicken. And that's your base recipe for any cooked pie filling, no matter what fruit you want to use.
Thank you. And another question just came in, which is what kind of shortening? Well, you said at the beginning that it was the vegetable shortening that you
Yes.
like to use.
Yes, so I use vegetable shortening. Anything that's like you can find it in the baking aisle of grocery stores. Generally, those will be the best ones to use because they're meant for baking. And you'll find that fats that are used for baking are always hard. You don't find like you could use margarine in place of shortening, but you wouldn't want to use the spreadable margarine that you take from your fridge and it's spreadable. You want to use something that's hard. So a baking margarine, a hard shortening. Those are the two best options that I find to use for baking doughs.
Thank you. So just remind everybody, put your questions in the Q&A and Sarah will answer some more towards the end.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see very clearly how much liquid has come out of these fruits, but it's super liquidy and you can see that the fruit is starting to cook down. We want to make sure that the rhubarb is cooked, that the strawberries are cooked, or else they're going to stay a little too hard. So I'm going to keep this going. You'll know it's ready when the rhubarb starts to break down a little bit. So rhubarb breaks down quite easily. So do strawberries, actually. So this is a pretty quick cooking pie filling. But you'll see the rhubarb, some of the smaller pieces will start to get mushy. And some of the larger pieces will stay intact. And that's kind of where I like to stop it because you do want some visible pieces of fruit in your pie filling. You don't want it to just be a mushy mess. You want it to have some really nice chunks of strawberry and rhubarb or whatever fruit you're using so that people can see when they bite into it what they're eating. And you eat with your eyes, right? So it's so delicious to see a nice chunk of strawberry or a beautiful chunk of rhubarb in your pie filling when you cut into it. But we're almost there. You can see some of the rhubarb is starting to break down. So now's the time that we're going to mix our starch together. I'm going to add the starch to this. Okay, so I just have a container on the side here. I'm going to dump in my cornstarch first. And I'm going to mix it with water to form a slurry. So just 1 part cornstarch, 1 part water. Just use a fork or a small whisk to make sure that that's smooth. If you have chunks of cornstarch and you pour it into this hot mixture, it will stay as a chunk. So make sure that it's smooth and that it doesn't have any lumps of cornstarch in it. Happens pretty quickly, happens pretty easily. And I'm going to pour this into my boiling filling right now, and it's going to thicken it almost immediately. I'm going to dump the whole thing. Again, like I said, if you're using frozen fruit, I was using frozen rhubarb. Generally doesn't have a super high moisture content, but if I was using frozen strawberries as well, you might want to consider adding a little bit of extra cornstarch because frozen fruit tends to let go of a little bit more liquid as it cooks. So this is already thickening. And as it thickens, you want to stir it a bit more frequently because it has a higher tendency to burn. Another thing about using cornstarch in recipes is that when you add cornstarch to something, you can taste it. So you want to cook out the cornstarch. So anytime you add cornstarch to a recipe, you do want to let it continue to cook for a couple of minutes. And that will get rid of the starch flavor and bring out those fruit flavors. If I just took it off immediately from the heat, you'd be able to taste the cornstarch in it. So I'm going to let it go for another minute. And I'm just boiling it away. You can see it's very thick. If you find that your recipe it's like looking a little liquidy, when you drag your spoon across the inside, it's not leaving a space. Just add a little bit more cornstarch, but honestly, this is perfect. So I'm just cooking out that starch flavor for a minute or two. It's great. Okay, and that's it. It's pretty quick, pretty simple. And this is going to give me a perfect consistency for my tart. So I'm just going to take this off the heat. We're going to let this cool. And in the meantime, we're going to make the crumble topping. Okay, so in the same mixer, don't need to wash it, it's all the same stuff. So the crumble, again, we're using shortening. That's just my preferred fat here. Shortening goes in first. Shortening and sugar. And I'm going to beat this together a little bit before I add the oats and the flour. The reason why is because flour has gluten in it. And so the more that we mix flour, the tougher the product is going to be. So we want this to be really nice and tender, a nice crumbly tender topping. And also the oats. I have large flake oats here. And you could put them in, but they kind of break up as it mixes. So I prefer to put them in at the end just because it leaves those beautiful, nice flakes of oats through your crumble. So sugar and brown sugar and shortening in here. I'm just going to let that go for a minute. Make sure that your attachments are on correctly before you start. Great. And I'm just creaming this together. So when you mix fat and sugar, that's called creaming. And depending on what you're making, you want to cream to different levels. So if you're making, let's say, a butter cake or a cake, a nice light fluffy cake, you're going to want to mix these two a lot. And when you mix fat and sugar together, it starts to get light and fluffy. And that's what's going to give you air inside your cake. For this, we want a nice crisp crumble topping. We're not too worried about it having a lot of air in it. So you don't need to mix it too much. You just want to make sure it's smooth and come together nicely. And again, we're going to always scrape down the sides of our bowl just to make sure that everything is mixed properly. Make sure that the rotation of the paddle comes to a complete stop before you put your hands anywhere near this. I'm just going to go in with a spatula and just bring everything down from the sides and make sure you're scraping off the edges of the paddle. So you can add different things in a crumble too. You can use almonds. You can use ground almonds or whole almonds for an extra crunch. You can use different spices if you want. I like cinnamon. I think it's a really nice warm flavor for any crumble topping. And like I said, there are different variations of this recipe. If you want to forget the crust altogether, you think, okay, that's too much work. I'm not going to bother filling all those little tart shells. You can just forget the crust. You can make a crisp. So a crisp is just a fruit filling with a crumble topping in the oven. So in a casserole dish or a small dish, there's no crust. And that's just as good with a scoop of like whipped cream or like a dairy-free substitute for whipped cream. Delicious. So that's an easy alternative. Okay, so that's mixed together nicely. I'm going to add my flour in now and my cinnamon. And I'm using all-purpose flour for these recipes. But if you had an allergy, let's say one of your friends you were having over for this dinner was celiac or gluten-free, you can buy, just from your grocery store, it's super easy to find nowadays, gluten-free flour blends. So one that's readily available at the grocery store is Bob's Red Mill. I see it at most grocery stores, and they have a gluten-free baking flour blend. And it's a combination of different starches that work well in baking to make doughs and cookies and breads. And it really takes the guesswork out of gluten-free products. You just pretty much substitute it one for one. So instead of flour, you just straight substitute gluten-free flour. You can buy it at the store. And everything besides that is pretty much the same. So it's super easy to adapt this recipe for whoever you need to. And it really doesn't change the end product. It's all the same instructions. You just substitute your gluten-free flour. And I find most gluten-free flour blends are like a one-for-one substitute, so you don't need to do any calculations, but always just look at the packaging instructions because they may suggest something else. Everyone that I've used has been a straight 1-for-1 conversion. Okay, so that's done. Very quick again. So every component of this recipe really does come together pretty quickly. It might seem intimidating at first, but once you have a few tips and tricks, baking is actually really fun and really quite easy most of the time. You can come up with something very nice with a lot of easy recipes. So now I've just got this beautiful crumble. You might want to mix it with your hand a little bit, just depending. This is kind of a small recipe. So in a mixer this size, sometimes it doesn't mix evenly. So I'm just going to go in with my hands. Just make sure your hands are clean. And if you didn't have a mixer, this recipe, super easy just to mix with your hands. You can just do it with your hands just right from the beginning if you don't mind getting your hands dirty. Just wash your hands and just get in there. Smush up the shortening with the sugar, add in the flour, mix it up. And you're going to end up with something that when you squish it in your hand, it'll hold a shape. Okay, so that means like that's nice and moist. The fat is gonna melt a little bit as it cooks. So it's not just like a sandy texture, it's more of like a nice crispy cookie texture, but it still crumbles nicely. Beautiful. Okay, that's great. So now we have all three of our components ready. We have our crust, we have our filling, and we have our crumble. And all we need to do now is just assemble it. I'm gonna clean off my hands here. Now, ideally, you'd want to leave your fruit filling to cool a little bit more than what I'm going to do today. It's still steaming. You'd want to give it another few minutes just to come to room temperature. That's best. But it's not the end of the world. You can kind of take a shortcut and do that as long as you put them directly in the oven. But just for time's sake today, I'm going to fill these crusts right away. And you can see that the pie filling is really nice and creamy. It's not too thick, but it will get thicker as it cools. So right now it's really hot, so it's looks kind of like lava, you know, kind of rolls down to the other side of the pan. And as it cools, it will get thicker. You'd be able to cut this and take a slice out of a pie and it would hold its shape once it's cool. Okay. I'm just gonna bring my pre-baked tart shells all ready to go. They're still in the molds. Don't remove them from the molds. The reason being is that we're adding like a wet filling, so we don't want the crust to get soft as it gets hot again, and then it might crack with the weight of the filling and the crumble. So you want to make sure that these are nice and cool before we fill them. Same with your filling, but today we're just going to put it in hot. So I'm just going to scoop in the filling. It ends up being about a 1/4 cup in each of these little pies. But you can just see whatever vessel you're putting it in, you just want to fill it up. Be nice and generous with your fruit filling. Just be careful, it's a little hot, but I'm just going to scoop it in and just fill it up. It doesn't take too much with these little tarts, but I find that individual desserts, especially these days, are really quite nice. You're not sharing. If you're having a few friends over, it's nice to give everyone their own portion instead of sharing. So. And you can still see nice chunks of strawberry. You can see chunks of rhubarb. You know exactly what you're eating. And I always find that really important. You want to know what you're eating. You want to be able to see when you look at something that you go, oh, strawberry rhubarb, that's my favorite. You know, you don't want to be guessing, what am I eating? I don't think that's that. And what a better way to celebrate the 3rd day of summer than to make strawberry rhubarb tarts, because I really can't think of a more classic summer flavor combination. And strawberry rhubarb. So light. Okay. And with the cooked pie filling, it's really not going to move. Like it's not going to move while it's baking. So you can fill it right up to the top. You don't have to worry. It's thick enough to not fall over the sides. Just stay right there, just right where you put it. That's what I love about cooked pie fillings is there's no guessing. You just know exactly what you're getting. So just make sure all your tarts are filled. And then we're just going to go on with the crumble topping. So that's up to you how much you want to put on. Crumble is my favorite part, so I'm going to load it on. But if you just want a little bit, you just put a little bit. It's not going to change the recipe at all. So I'm just going to fold the tart over the bowl of crumble just so that I can kind of go wild. Make a little bit less of a mess here. And I'm just keeping nice big chunks. There's nice big chunks of crumble in here. You get a nice bite when you bite into it. I'm just covering the top with this crumble filling, sticking it down to the fruit filling so it doesn't go anywhere while we're baking. And you're going to have your oven, you're going to have had it at 350 for the tart shells. It's going to be 350 again for this part, so it's pretty easy. There's no need to change your oven temperature. And this crumble is going to cook and get really nice and golden brown on top, crispy. And surprisingly, the tart shells, they're not going to cook that much more. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to put these already look cooked, and I want to put it in for another half an hour, are you sure? Yeah, it's not going to cook much more. You just want to cook that crumble topping. The filling is cooked, crust is cooked. So all we're cooking is that crumble topping. Like I said, it's super easy. It's super simple when you do it this way. All right. Okay, last one. Pretty much the perfect amount of crumble for me. So I put about 25 grams of filling on each tart. And just like that. And these are ready to go in the oven. We're going to bake them for about a half an hour until the crumble gets nice and golden brown. I don't have an oven here, but these will be ready to go. And then when they're finished, they look almost the same. Pretty much the same. Just a little bit nice and golden brown on top, really crispy. You can still see those oats. I still got them in the little molds. These have cooled down. So you're going to want to let them cool completely. That's very important before you take them out of these molds, or else they may fall apart on you. So very important, do make sure that you're patient and that you let the tarts cool down. But once they're cool, this cookie crust is really quite durable. So you can just pop them right out of the tart like this, and they're stable enough to hold. Now these specific molds have a little piece on the bottom, so I'm just going to turn them sideways and just try to take that little piece off the bottom, and it should come right off just like that. And there you go. Sturdy little tart, ready to eat. Crisp crust, crisp crumble, beautiful, vibrant filling. And if you want to take your dessert to the next level, which I always like to do, you eat with your eyes first. So always add a little garnish, whatever you have. If you have an extra strawberry from the filling, if you have a little bit of icing sugar laying around, that'd be great. So I'm just going to plate this up as if I was serving it to a guest. So I actually had some whipped topping. So I use like a dairy-free substitute for whipped topping. And I like to under whip it a little bit for garnishes, just because I think it looks really pretty when it kind of melts onto the top. So I'm just going to grab a big spoon and I'm just going to put a dollop of this. And if you had icing sugar too, I have my little sugar shaker here. A little bit of icing sugar is beautiful on these tarts. Adds a little bit of sweetness. And I have this nice soft whipped topping. You can just buy this at the grocery store. You can even buy it pre-whipped. Make a difference in this particular application. I'm just going to dollop a little bit on top, and it'll just be so pretty and so delicious. You can serve these warm if you want. So these are at room temperature. You can take them out of the mold and you can just pop them back in the oven for 5 or 10 minutes and serve them warm. That would be really nice too. And I also have a little bit of washed mint here. So I'm just going to use that just because it's pretty. Another thing you could use, like I said, you could put a piece of strawberry. You can maybe, if you have an orange, you could zest some orange on top of this. That would be delicious. Here. There we go. And how cute does that look? Just a little individual tart. Whipped cream, mint, beautiful crisp crust. That'll be so impressive for your guests. And that's it. Just super simple. Super simple dessert. You don't need to be intimidated by things like this. It actually comes together really easily as long as you know a few tips and tricks. And if there's any other questions, be happy to answer them now.
Ah, looks so delicious, Sarah. The only problem is I can't smell them from here or taste them from here, but
Well,
I
I
would
can
love
assure you,
to.
it smells delicious.
Yeah, a number of questions. So people are really paying attention, I think, and making notes.
Okay, great.
Can sugar substitute be used in the crust or in the topping?
Yes, you can. I always find personally that sugar substitutes like sweeteners have a really harsh sweetness to them. So I might use a little less. That's just my personal taste, just because I find sweeteners to be extra sweet, and I prefer a subtle sweetness to my desserts. You want that fruit sweetness, that natural sweetness from the fruit to really shine through on this. So yes, you can use sugar substitutes, but I would just maybe reduce the quantity a little bit just so you don't get that harsh sweetener sweetness.
Okay. Another question is, can you add orange juice to the cornstarch instead of water to give the mixture even more flavor?
Absolutely, you can. That's a great idea. You can add any liquid you want. You can even take some of the liquid from the pan. Just water is super easy, and just for this purpose, it was easy to show. But you can use any liquid you want with the cornstarch as long as it's mixed in and you don't have any lumps of cornstarch. Orange juice is a great idea.
Great. And I'm not sure whether you answered this. Do you use the same shortening for the crumble that you used for the dough?
Yes, I do. It's just way easier that way. You buy one thing from the grocery store instead of mixing it up with a bunch of ingredients. So both work perfectly for the crust and the crumble.
And speaking of the vegetable shortening, do you have a brand in particular that you recommend or that you like to use?
So we buy wholesale. So we use a brand called Bungee. It comes in a giant block. So I don't think you can buy that at the grocery store, but any brand that you can find, as long as it's a hard baking shortening, like that comes in a block, any brand will work fine. They're all mostly the same. I haven't noticed any difference in changing brands of shortening. The only thing I'll say it again is just make sure you're using a hard fat and not a soft fat, so not a spreadable from the fridge. That's the only difference that you need to look out for, but then you can interchange.
Okay, thank you. And another question, can tapioca be used instead of cornstarch as a thickener? And if so, what would the amount be?
Yes, you can use tapioca starch, you can use potato starch, you can use a number of different starches in place of cornstarch if you have an allergy. And I would say the quantity would be roughly the same. I would maybe just add it half first, see what your consistency looks like before adding the whole amount. And like I said, what I love about cooked pie fillings is you can play around with it before it's too late. So if you add the tapioca, let's say, and you're finding it acts a little bit different in your recipe, maybe it's too thick. And you think, oh my goodness, I've ruined this pie filling. It's too thick. No, just add a little bit of juice, add a little bit of water, and it's back to normal. Or if you don't have enough starch, if you think, oh, this seems a little watery, then just mix a little bit more starch with a little more water or orange juice or whatever you have and add it in. So you can really change up your filling before you put it into your pie, and you have a lot of room for adjustments if you need it. So you can definitely use different starches in this, and I would say it would probably be about the same. But if you're a little worried, then just add it bit by bit and see how it goes.
Okay. Can this be baked using a convection oven?
Yes, so I have a convection oven at work. And if you are using a convection oven, I generally would decrease the temperature by about 25 degrees. So if you have your convection fan on, you're going to get a much higher circulation of heat and things are going to cook a little faster. So I would keep the timing the same, but reduce the temperature by about 25 degrees. So instead of baking at 350, you'd bake at 325 with your convection fan on.
Okay. So there's a question or a discussion going on in the question and answers about Crisco, whether Crisco could be used or whether Crisco is too soft.
Crisco can be used. Crisco can be used, yes. So Crisco is great for pie crust as well. So Crisco is great. Crisco is not too soft. I don't know how to explain myself here. You want the shortening to be soft at room temperature, but just not soft from the fridge. Okay, so Crisco, like if you put that in the fridge, it might be harder, more like the consistency of butter. But just as long as it holds its shape at room temperature, you'll be fine. And realistically, like you could make this recipe with a softer fat if that's all you had. You just might not get exactly the same results as what I've shown you here, and that's why I'm recommending a harder fat, but Crisco would work perfectly.
Sarah, this has been wonderful and certainly whet my appetite, and I'm going to go to the market tomorrow and get some fresh strawberries and rhubarb and make something. Great. And I think my grandchildren will all be very excited about the recipe. Thank you so much. You've given us a wonderful recipe, wonderful directions, and lots of little tips along the way. So we really appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Also want to thank Ellen Melman, who is the chair of the catering committee at the Adat Israel, for putting together this series. I think people who have participated have really enjoyed the 3 different caterers and their different approaches and the various recipes that they've given us. And I would encourage everyone to use our caterers and to call them for, they will make these recipes or any of the offerings that they have every week. So that would be good. We've had a lot of requests to do more. So we're just considering that, and we'll see what's happening. The Women of Adat have some exciting programs coming up that are just in the works. We're putting together. Just watch all the advertising for it. And thank you all for watching, and we certainly thank the caterers, and we have to thank Anna Gidlin at Shul for keeping us organized technically, and I thank you all, and can have a good day. The sun is still shining. There's time still for a walk. Thank you all.